Hey everyone, welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I have the great pleasure of having Dr. Tom Rudelius on the channel today. And so let me tell you a little bit about Tom. Welcome, Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Tom is a theoretical physicist. He's a professor at Durham University in the UK. And so he's working on string theory, and he's also a Christian and wrote this book, Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. And I recently read this book. I loved it. I love reading people's stories of coming to faith, and he has a really cool one. So it's unique, and I identify with a lot of parts of his story. So I'm excited to have you on today. Thanks for coming, Tom.
Yeah, thanks again. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I mean, as far as my career, as you said, I'm a professor at Durham University. Before this, I was an undergrad at Cornell. I did my PhD at Harvard, and I did postdocs at Princeton, at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, and then Berkeley. Um, Faith-wise, I grew up in a very non-religious but also a very loving family, and I came to faith in college largely through conversations with my twin brother. And as you say, I've written this book about that story, about my journey to faith and my journey of faith as a scientist since then.
Awesome. Well, how it and of course we can't give away all the details that are in the book, but do you want to just tell a short version of how you came to faith?
Yeah. So as I said, I grew up in a non-religious family. I had a mom, a dad, and a twin brother named Steve. And So Steve and I went to different colleges. I went to Cornell. He went to Northwestern, and it was his freshman year there that Steve came to faith through conversations with some guys that he met on his floor. That whole story is also a much longer version is in the book as well. But basically, he started talking with me. He started telling me about God and about Jesus, and sort of for the first time, I started having to think a lot harder about these sorts of questions. I'd always grown up thinking, I'm basically a good person. If there's a heaven, I'll probably go to it, and that was kind of good enough. That was all I felt that I needed to know, and there were just other things in my life that seemed more important. So I guess my journey to faith, it was a lot into there was the intellectual component of having conversations with Steve and reading the Bible, reading some other books, arguing both for and against Christianity, coming to decide what I believe. There's also maybe even the more important part was coming to realize that I needed this. I remember distinctly a conversation with Steve where I was arguing, I think I'm good. I think people in general are good. Like I don't really think that we have this need for forgiveness for salvation.
Yeah.
Um, and so for me, it was that experience actually taking a polygraph, trying to get a top secret security clearance, that revealed to me kind of that, actually I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. And I started having to be really honest about everything I've done wrong in my life. I realized that there's actually a lot more than I would have liked to believe. And deep down, I'm not as good of a person as I'd like to think I am. And so that, a little bit of a teaser, I guess, and you can read the book for more, but that's really what I think changed my perspective, not only the intellectual belief, but also kind of the heart level of understanding my need for this God.
Yes, and I think a lot of people that aspect of your book will help a lot of people because I've talked to so many people that just feel like, well, I don't understand this Jesus as savior. Like, I'm a good person. Why would I need a savior? And so I think that's, a common feeling that a lot of people have. So I love that part of your book and so many other parts of your book too. So yeah,
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
cool. So, uh, like, what inspired you to actually write this book?
Yeah. I guess, I mean, in part, there was someone from my publisher, Tyndale, calling me and saying, would you like to write a book on science and faith? But I think that the vision that they might have had when they made that call, and the vision that I had that got turned into this book were, I think, quite different. I think there are a lot of good books on there about science and faith. Um, but what I often found is that when you read books from scientists, whether they're Christians, whether they're atheists, it's usually from this perspective of like, oh, I'm a scientist. I've kind of figured everything out, and I have all the answers. And I feel like that to me it isn't just a really it isn't a very good reflection of what my faith journey was actually like. Where I feel like my faith journey was a lot about kind of coming to grips with the uncertainty in a lot of areas where I don't have the answers. Um, and I think that ultimately what I produced then, at least what I hope to produce, is just a really honest account of what it's like when someone comes to faith. And it's not such a clean story of like, oh, once I had doubts and then I got smart and now I know everything. It's more like this journey of coming to have my beliefs challenged, not only by arguments, but also as my experiences changed and as my outlook on the world changed. Um, and so I think that's kind of the story. The goal is to not maybe answer every question that someone might have, but at least my hope is that anyone who reads my book would be able to sort of see their own journey in mine somewhere along the way.
Okay, cool. So is it kind of like it's giving people permission to live in a state of uncertainty? Like it's okay to be a person of faith and not have all the answers.
Yeah, I think so. That's sort of I think that for the person of faith, I think that that's maybe the hope that I would have. And I think for the person who's reading the book who's maybe not a person of faith, I guess I would hope that they would start to recognize that it's not just faith that comes with uncertainty. It's really every aspect of our lives that comes with uncertainty. Every aspect of what we do, and even science, right? I mean, every scientific experiment has error bars. Every scientific experiment comes with this like measure of uncertainty. So I think it's not so much about being able to avoid uncertainty, because we can't do that no matter how we try. It's really about being able to navigate and live within this world that inherently has that uncertainty. So I would hope at least that it's a challenge not only for the Christian and the person of faith, but also for the person who maybe doesn't consider themselves a person of faith, but actually does indeed, like I did before I became a Christian, have faith commitments and have a worldview that also requires some amount of faith and comes with some amount of uncertainty.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, and I think it will help people like that. And it's so what about like what would you say on your faith journey along the way, what have been your most important discoveries about God?
Um, yeah, I mean that's okay. That's a difficult question. I think that and it's something that too that in different moments of my faith journey, in different moments of my life, there have been different things about God that that really kind of stuck with me and changed me. And I think I kind of mentioned one already, which was kind of this understanding that I too am in need of forgiveness. Like despite my good my generally being a nice guy and like having a good resume and all of these things, that like ultimately I too am also needed forgiveness. I too am also a very broken individual. I think something that as I've grown in my faith, something I've really come to appreciate is that I think that forgiveness that God offers, that is like one aspect of the good news. But really, I think that the gospel is good news, kind of no matter where we are in life and no matter what we're struggling with. Where, as I said, at the beginning, it was kind of this real recognition of, hey, I need forgiveness, and like, hey, there's a God for that, right? Like our God offers that through Jesus's death on the cross. But there have been other times in my life where I've been struggling with life and struggling, with mental health issues, with anxiety, with doubt, struggling with different things. And I think what I've come to see is that the gospel is big enough for those too. Something that someone once told me, a wise man once told me, is that what Jesus came to really offer us first and foremost wasn't forgiveness but life, and that forgiveness is the mechanism by which we get that life. And I think that that's kind of something that I've found living the Christian life, um, is that the gospel is big enough, kind of no matter what I'm dealing with. And yet that also doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy, right? That there's something inherent about our faith in worshiping a crucified God, that somehow we can rejoice in our sufferings, and that somehow those difficult times can actually be part of a greater good news.
Awesome. So, I love how your book talks about like the struggles with doubt after becoming a Christian. Would you share like some of those struggles?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I think it's helpful to like distinguish the sorts of doubts and the struggles that I've had into two categories. Um, One of those is like kind of the like annoying, persistent questions and mysteries that I kind of I think that I will go through my entire life kind of like chewing at. So for me, one example of this is the hiddenness of God. Why doesn't God just make himself more obvious to us? And another one is what's up with some of those passages in the Old Testament that just seem like so weird and backwards to me. And in my book, I talk about kind of wrestling with those. And what I guess I would say is that as I've gone on, I've gotten sort of partial answers to these questions. That sometimes I hear something in a sermon, I read it in a book, I experience it in life that kind of gives me some new insight into this. But to be honest, it doesn't completely satisfy me. It's not like a complete answer to the question that I find, just makes the doubts go away completely. It's just something that's there that I kind of chew on, and I think that it's very possible to, have those sorts of questions and those sorts of doubts, and to still live a life of faith. Um,
Mhm.
the other the other element that I've also experienced is not just sort of like those nagging, persistent doubts, but like really crushing, debilitating um, obsessions over certain questions and doubts. And for me, I've had a few seasons of that, something like maybe 4 or 5 of those seasons, lasting anywhere from like a couple weeks to like 8 or 9 months. Um, and it took me a long time to realize that what I thought those were just really really bad times of doubt, like really difficult intellectual questions. But what I eventually came to realize is that those were actually really just manifestations of like anxiety and mental health issues that for me were playing itself out in the realm of my religious faith. And I think that that's something that I found actually is a lot more common than when it first was happening to me, I was thinking like, man, what is going on with me? Like, why can't I just like stop thinking about like the evidence for the resurrection or whatever doubt it
Mhm.
is? Like, why can't I like stop thinking about this and having to convince myself of it every moment? But I kind of now realize that this is true for a lot of people. This is like these sorts of mental health issues are very common, and among Christians, I'd say that they're relatively common even in the area of our faith. And what I discovered too is that in those sorts of moments, what I really needed were not answers to my questions, but like treatment for my mental health issues. Um, and so I think to me, like it's really important to distinguish those two, because when I was having the latter type of these obsessive doubts, it's like, okay, that no matter how hard I try to convince myself, if my brain has just been hijacked by these completely irrational thoughts, like no amount of rationality, no amount of like thinking through the issue is really going to like solve it. So I think that's what I'd say too to Christians who are experiencing that kind of like faith crisis, obsessive doubts. Like consider that maybe it's actually not an intellectual answer that you need. Maybe it's treatment that you need.
Okay, what kind of treatment like has helped you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm a bit hesitant even because I know that it like different for
Mhm.
everybody.
Yeah.
But I've seen like I've gone to a therapist for a while. I've gone to like a counselor in my church. I think that what I often have found is just kind of putting those questions, those doubts, those issues aside, and doing things that are going to be good for me regardless. Like spending time with friends, um, going or like going out and playing sports or exercising or just doing something that I enjoy. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I guess I'd say kind of taking my mind off of it and seeking to live just like a healthy life in general has probably been the most important thing.
Cool. And thanks. And I hope that will help some people because I think that's really an interesting discovery that you made about how like it was kind of like these mental health issues that were causing you to latch on to certain things. And there's probably a lot of people that are struggling with that as well.
Mm.
So, in your book, you kind of touched on this, the issues with creation and science. And so, of course, most of the people who watch this channel know that I'm a young earth creationist. And I also love to hear perspectives of people who are not. So, and especially with you as a scientist, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how God created.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, in two words, I guess my viewpoint would be described as theistic evolution.
Uh huh.
Excuse me. And as a physicist, I'm really not an expert in evolution at all. Like what I
Hmm.
know about evolution mainly came from like first year biology classes in like middle school and high school and whatever. So I don't pretend to be an expert on evolution by any means. Um, but I guess what I do know a bit more about is like the cosmology and the early universe. And and I guess I find, I mean, I think that like the evidence for an old universe, and like the the universe is like 14 billion years old, is like quite compelling to me. I mean, I would say like pretty overwhelming. Now, I
Hmm.
think there is, and I've heard like young Earth creationists kind of, there's kind of two camps you can fall into there. You could say like, oh well, actually, like the scientists are all just like morons, and they just like made all the wrong, they've measured the wrong things, they've done the wrong calculations. I don't think that's reasonable.
Hmm.
The more interesting one I think is like, well, maybe God just created a universe that like is old, right? Like that God creates a universe 6,000 years ago that has already like has the full appearance of age. Um,
Hmm.
as a physicist, there isn't like a see as a physicist, all you know is what you can measure. Like questions of ontology, questions of what is real, is really like a philosophical question. So to a physicist, there's no difference between a universe that's like 6,000 years that was created like 6,000 years ago with a built-in past, or even like 5 seconds ago with a built-in past, versus a universe that's actually 14 billion years old, right? Um, so like there is a way to go that direction, like that I think is at least like consistent.
Hmm.
Um, but what I would also say is that I guess to me the question is, why, like, what is the logic for why we should think that that the world is like that, right? And I think what it kind of comes out of is the desire, which is a good one, I think, to be like faithful to the text, right? To say like,
Hmm.
Bible says so is so. So if the universe is, if it says the universe is 6,000 years old, then like we should trust what the Bible says.
Hmm.
I guess to me, like, and this is maybe the hallmark of my view as a theistic evolution person, is that I think that like if God wanted to give us a really clear like scientific textbook, he could have done that with scripture. Like he could have
Right.
talked about like gauge theories and string theory and quantum field theory and like all of these things that I wish I understood better than I do, right? Like, but I think that to me, when I read the scriptures, especially the early passages, let's say of like Genesis 1, um, it seems to me that this is less concerned with giving us a scientific account and more concerned with giving us sort of the I don't know, the meaning of all that's going on, and what this tells us, not so much about how the world was created, but why it was created, who its creator is, and what our purpose is within it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, I've come a long way as a creationist. Okay. I will say my first looking into it was a desire to keep, like, preserve a very literal meaning of Genesis. But now I would say like my main reason for not believing in evolution is actually scientific. Like if people want to talk to me about like, oh, let's try to interpret, I've heard some good ways of interpreting scripture that help evolution fit in with it. So I wouldn't, exactly
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
my main objection is now scientific. So, but
Yeah, yeah.
I know that's not your area of specialty, so I don't want to go into that as much, but I would like to dig in on what is you said you think there's quite compelling evidence for the universe
Yeah.
being 14 billion years old. And it's interesting because like a month or two ago in the media, there was like all this hype about an article that came out with a scientist, Dr. Gupta, who's now proposing that actually the universe is 26 billion years old. And so like you know
Yeah.
what is the compelling evidence for the 14 billion year old figure?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think there are a number of astrophysical experiments um, that uh, have seek to measure essentially the age of the universe. Probably the one I'm most familiar with, which I think is one of the most compelling, is the cosmic microwave background, which is measuring like the afterglow of the Big Bang, and basically from studying the how the temperature fluctuations on one side of the cosmic microwave background map to another, you can fit that to a model of the universe extremely well with like extraordinary precision. And ultimately, what that's telling you is approximately the Hubble rate, which tells you approximately the age of the universe. And of course, as I say, like in all scientific experiments, there are error bars in this. So I'm not gonna, die on the hill of like 14 billion years versus like 13.5 billion years. But I think that to me, it's compelling that you can come up with a theoretical model that requires very few parameters relatively that maps so well onto these experiments that can actually be done. And so to me, I mean, to me, that's really what all of science is. When we talk about what is evidence for any sort of model in science, you build a theory, you do an experiment, and when those match, that usually tells you that your theory's onto something.
Okay, well, can you explain like what is it about the CMB that makes you confident that that is the like leftover radiation from the Big Bang?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, it's this mix between theory and experiment where um, the cosmic microwave background is something that's predicted from what we know of atomic physics, right? That you can just like take atoms and study them and study their properties. And what you find is that what you predict is that shortly after the Big Bang, there should be this recombination that occurs, and after that, the universe effectively goes from being uh, opaque to being transparent, so that light particles, photons from that time, just sort of come and reach us today. And lo and behold, when you actually go and you look with these satellites out in the distant regions of the universe, you find exactly that radiation that's predicted, with exactly the temperature, with exactly the properties that you'd expect if indeed the story is consistent. So it's that mix of having a consistent theory combined with predictions of that theory being borne out, which suggests that this is indeed what happened.
Okay. Well, I don't know how deeply we want to go into that because I would love to talk to you seriously more about that, but I didn't really prepare you with the questions that I might
Yeah,
ask
sure,
about that. So I don't want to go
sure,
too
yeah,
deep into it. But, I mean, from my perspective, the CMB, first of all, the prediction was off by an order of magnitude. So it's not a very good prediction for the Big Bang. And then second of all, there's the issues with like the axis of evil and like the fact that the CMB prediction is based on like things that we don't have any experimental evidence for, such as inflation. Like that's just something we made up, and it happens to solve like three major problems of the Big Bang, but it doesn't. We actually don't have any reason to believe that inflation exists. I mean that it was an actual thing that happened, right? So I don't know. Do you want to respond to that, or should we move on to string theory?
Well, I'm curious. What I mean, I would say that when we have evidence for things in science, it's because there's like some gap, which if we posit that thing, then that fills that gap. So I guess when you say we don't have evidence for inflation, like what would you say counts as evidence for inflation?
Well, I mean, it's very, first of all, it's very difficult to, uh, do kind of retro, observation. Like we can't, we, this is the type of hypothesis that would be very difficult to test in the first place because we're talking about something that would have happened so long ago. And, in a way that's not easy for us to test. But what I'm saying is like the difference between, you know, storytelling and science is that science is things that we have empirical observations. Like we're able to make, observations or test and retest. And then, what inflation is really what I would put into the category of storytelling, where we have these inconvenient things for the model, like things that are very inconvenient for the model and would actually destroy the model. And instead of letting the model be destroyed, we try to make something, a proposal that will fill it up and make it like, okay, it'll all work out if this thing happened. But I haven't been given a reason to believe that inflation could happen. I mean, this is something we have no idea how it, like, what, like, physical process could have initiated this, right? And like, I don't know. So, and
Well,
then like we
I don't know
have
if I'd
no
agree with
evidence
that,
that it
but
actually did happen. Mhm.
okay. I don't know if I'd agree with that. I mean, we have a microscopic theory of inflation of like a rolling scalar field that seems to work pretty well. And I'm not sure if in the end of the day that's the right explanation, but it is like it is a microscopic derivation of this phenomenon, or it isn't a microscopic explanation of like the phenomena we observe. So I guess I'm confused about like how much like layers of explanation are needed before it becomes like a compelling story. And I guess actually I have one other question, which is,
Mhm.
even if you think okay, inflation is like not the right answer, um, like what makes you convinced then that the answer is like 6,000 years? Like suppose it's not 14 billion. What would make you say like, oh, it's obviously way shorter than that?
Right. Well, my answer, and I'm not sure about the number 6,000. I mean, I'm a young earth creationist. I'm not a 6,000 year creationist. So, but actually, uh, I wouldn't say that right now, my belief in young earth creation is much more theological than my belief in, uh, n- against evolution. Do you
Oh,
see what I'm
okay,
saying? Like
okay, yeah,
my
I
belief
see what you
in
mean. Yeah, okay, that
evolution
makes sense. Yeah,
is like purely scientific. Okay. My belief in young earth creation, it does come more from my
okay,
belief in the Bible, but not the literal Genesis account, but because of the genealogies of Jesus Christ.
okay,
So it would, and a few other things, but
yeah,
um, so I have to admit that my young earth creation is more theological, but that being said, it doesn't mean that my young earth creation is anti-scientific. What I mean is I believe there's some good evidence against the young earth. Okay, so I can point
okay,
to isotope dating and say that's good evidence against the young earth. Okay. But then there's other evidence that is scientific that is for the young earth.
Okay.
There's quite a bit of it actually. A lot of people like to present that like, oh, young earth creationists, they're just anti-science, they don't believe in science. But actually, if you listen to the best young earth creationists, and there's some bad ones, like there are young earth creationists who you can tell they are like committed to their young earth creation, and they're willing to either lie or, I mean, in the worst cases, lie. But in some cases, just try really hard to, um, push their agenda, their theological agenda. But there are some young earth creationists who have come to this because of their scientific exploration in combination with their faith. And there's some very strong arguments for young earth creation that people don't always hear. So yeah, that could be like a really long conversation. I totally like would love to have it with you because you seem like very reasonable and awesome scientist. So uh, I I hope we can have a further conversation about that. Do you want to say anything about that before we move on to string theory?
No, sure. We can talk about string theory if you like. Yeah.
Okay. So I tried to read a book about string theory like 20 years ago. It was really hard to understand. I mean, I got maybe some of the basic, but could you tell us about string theory?
Yeah. So string theory is this rather speculative theory from modern physics. And basically, the idea is like everything in the world that we used to think of as point particles is actually made of tiny little vibrating strings. Now, you might ask, why on earth should we believe? Like, why would people come up with such a theory and spend so much time working on it? And the answer is that basically what this is about is a search for a quantum theory of gravity, or a theory of quantum gravity. So quantum mechanics and general relativity, which is Einstein's theory of gravity, both work incredibly well in their own domains of validity. But ultimately, if you want to put them together, you'll find that you can build a perfectly good theory up to very, very high energy scales. And at very, very high energies, you find that this quantum theory of gravity that you've built has got to break down. Now that's not like a problem necessarily. This is true for most of our theories of physics, which is that they work in their own domains of validity. They have their regimes of approximation, but ultimately, when you start moving beyond the place where these theories and these approximations work, then you need to come up with some sort of new paradigm. And that's what string theory is all about. It's a theory of that aims to address this incompatibility between gravity and quantum mechanics that arises at very, very high energies. So that's its claim to fame. That's why people are interested in it. Excuse me. The issue with it is that because it requires such very high energies, that also makes it incredibly difficult to test experimentally. That even the best particle accelerators that we have today just can't reach anything near the energies required to actually just directly probe string theory and tell if it's right. So at present, sort of most of our knowledge of string theory comes almost exclusively from like mathematical calculations and a more theoretical understanding of what the theory is all about. So that's
Okay,
string theory. That's why it's kind of controversial, but yeah, there you go.
cool. Well, what about string theory makes you feel like it might be the true picture of reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the main thing is that so as I said, this isn't something. String theory is not something that we have like direct experimental evidence for,
Mhm.
but something that happens when you start getting into the very fundamental physics of quantum mechanics and gravity, what you start to find is that although experiment becomes less and less useful, excuse me, although experiment becomes less and less useful, the mathematics themselves become more and more constraining. So I would say that, why do I think that string theory is true? Probably yes. At the very least, it's I think, a good example of what a consistent theory of quantum gravity looks like, even if it's not the correct one that describes our universe. But I would also say that at this point, we've seen, I'd say, a number of not completely watertight, but nonetheless suggestive arguments that that ultimately there is just one consistent theory of quantum gravity, which in some sort of limit, in some regime, is going to be described by string theory. So that to me, I think, it's not so much that I experimentally, I think that the evidence, has proven that string theory is right. I think it's more that mathematically, it seems likely that there just isn't another consistent of theory of quantum gravity out there.
Okay. Does it have any major flaws?
Well, I think the testability is kind of one major flaw, and one aspect of that, which some people view as a feature, some people may view as a flaw, is that string theory seems to give rise not to just sort of a unique prediction for what the laws of nature that we observe should be like, but a vast set of like possible universes that could be described by different laws. So, like in our universe, right, we have forces like the strong force and the weak force and the electromagnetic force. But string theory says like, well, there could be there may exist consistent universes out there that have a lot more forces or have less forces or have different particles and different parameters. And that huge landscape of possibilities, as it's called, is a problem when it comes to like making unique experimental predictions, because simply put, the more possibilities you have, the harder it is to make a unique prediction. So I think that those are really the drawbacks of string theory. It's difficult to probe experimentally because it's at such high energies, and it doesn't make really clear, definitive predictions at low energies, at least as far as we've been able to tell so far.
Okay. Well, I mentioned to you in our email that in the past year or so, I've become kind of immersed in thinking about the Big Bang and the problems with the Big Bang.
Mhm.
So, does string theory solve any of the well, first of all, does it conflict with the Big Bang?
Um, Not as far as we know, though we don't especially know how, where we understand string theory is sort of in very special corners that don't do a great job of actually describing our world. So I think it's tough to say at the moment what exactly string theory would tell us about the Big Bang, if anything. But I would say that more generally, that the Big Bang, the moment, the like moment of creation itself, is something that's definitely sort of behind a wall of ignorance as of today.
Okay. Kevin, I see that Kevin put a question in the chat, and I just want to say anybody else who has questions, please do put your questions in the chat right now, and I'll try to get to those in a minute. I just wanted to ask a couple more questions about string theory. So I guess you kind of already answered this because I said, well, no, I mean, does it solve any of the problems of the Big Bang? Because there's some major problems facing the Big Bang right now for this model to remain, a feasible model. Would string theory possibly solve any of those?
Sorry, could you clarify what problems you're referring to?
Yes. So, well, and actually, it's not that recent of a discovery, but it's been made worse with the JWST observations of the distant galaxies. The issue of the galaxies being there at all, the issue of them being fully formed spiral galaxies that are, supposed to take billions of years to form, but they're there at the, hypothetical beginning toward the beginning of the start of the universe, if the Big Bang theory is correct. And then also the issues with the surface brightness of those galaxies. And then also the issues of like, you know, there not being, I mean, the entire structure of the Big Bang being built on like mostly on hypothetical entities and processes, such as we're depending on dark matter, dark energy, inflation, all things that are unobserved And like we are absolutely depending on those to hold up the model. So those are, I'd say, some of the issues.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I wouldn't call what you just described as the Big Bang theory.
Okay.
Like I would call that sort of the maybe the concordance model of cosmology.
Okay.
So when we talk about
Lambda
the Big
CP.
Bang,
Yeah.
we're talking about like the very first moments. Um,
Okay.
those are the moments where string theory probably has a role to play, is the earliest moments. But as I
Uh-huh.
say, the issue at present is that we don't really have such a great understanding of string theory, and especially how it applies in a cosmological context. So
Mhm.
that's why I say I think at present, questions of the Big Bang, what's happening at the moment of creation itself, are are something that ostensibly string theory could address, but at present is very much behind a wall of ignorance. Now, the sorts of questions the things that you're raising, that's much like later time cosmology. For the average person, that's still very early time cosmology. But for me as a string theorist, it's very late time cosmology. And I'd say most of those issues are more like astrophysical issues that um, string theory probably won't give great insight into. But I think I would push back, like you make those sound like really devastating issues with the model, and I would say that
Mhm.
I think kind of any area of science is going to explain some things, and then it's going to leave some other questions that we maybe still don't have a complete understanding of. So to me, I'd say that, for instance, adding in like postulating dark matter is a very minor like postulate that solves like a dozen different problems that have been seen in galactic physics and cosmology, and you can kind of address those in one fell swoop. Same thing with dark energy, where like there's a pretty clear explanation for where dark energy could come from. So at least to me, I don't view those as like catastrophic problems with the Big Bang. They're just aspects that we don't understand all that well yet.
What did you think is the like pretty good explanation for where dark energy could have come from?
Oh well, I mean, in general relativity, dark energy is as simple as adding a cosmological constant. And in fact, I think I would say, I mean, the real question with dark energy is where does it come from, but why is it so small? That if dark energy were a lot larger, then life, like galaxies, couldn't exist; they'd just be ripped apart. And if dark energy were a lot smaller, or if it were negative, then like everything in the universe would just collapse in less than a second. So I think the challenging problem, which is the so-called cosmological constant problem that's often raised in the context of fine tuning, is like, why is dark energy as small as it is? Because we would naturally expect it to be larger. But the question of, like, where does dark energy come from, or why does it exist at all? That's I think, from the perspective of the physics, that actually seems like a very natural thing to expect, is that there should be some dark energy.
Hmm. Okay, I'd love to have a longer conversation about
Yeah,
that
yeah,
sometime. So, what are you currently working on with string theory? Like, what are you exactly trying to do with it?
yeah. So a lot of my research deals with trying to ultimately bridge this gap between theory and experiment. And so, sorry. So the challenge here is that, as I say, there are so many different possibilities that are consistent with string theory, and so that makes it challenging to be able to extract unique predictions that could really lead to like definitive tests of string theory. So that's kind of like the direction that my research takes, is trying to figure out what are the things that string theory unambiguously predicts, and hopefully one of those things is something that could be tested in the future.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds like interesting work, and it sounds like it involves a lot of math.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm in the math department here. In the UK, like string theory is put in the math department, so it's very much like on the border between math and physics. That's right. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, I want to put up this question from Kevin Omni Kevlar. He says, "What is the best way one can best thing you can do to mitigate your bias? And do you think there are people where the evidence
Yeah.
cannot overcome their bias no matter how much they seek as impartially as they can?"
I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know if I should be like the like world expert on this question. I think just being aware that we all have biases is probably the first and most important thing. Um, but yeah, I think I don't know. I often feel that when you see people, like um, accusing of others of confirmation bias, that those people can sometimes be the most susceptible to confirmation bias themselves. And I think that, yeah, it's kind of, before, I guess when it comes to bias, if we really want to overcome it, we better start by pointing the finger at ourselves and asking, like, have I sort of been biased by my like upbringing or my education or whatever in ways that is affecting how I think. I don't know. Do you have
Cool.
a question? Do you have a thought on this, Rebecca?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of Kevin's background so you can kind of understand where he's coming from and maybe it will help you. He's been someone who grew up in a very fundamentalist
Hmm.
Christian background and then kind of started deconstructing his faith.
Hmm.
Now he is still a Christian, but he's really kind of wrestled with a lot of
Hmm.
topics in, with regard to his faith. And I think he's just, kind of feeling around with like, you know, the idea of like, okay, how can I, be sure that I'm not letting myself be, you know, influenced by my
Hmm.
desire for Christianity to be true.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah. So that's a question I have gotten, and what I would say, you know, when it comes to these sorts of questions, like I think that there's a healthy amount of recognizing, like, maybe my like, yeah, maybe my wish for this to be true is like affecting my impartiality. But I also think that there's an argument to be made here that, if it just so happens that like you and I have been built with all of these desires, for like a world of like peace and joy and life, and like a world without death. And if it just so happens that Christianity meets those desires, like it just so happens that like the resurrection of Jesus is exactly what we need to like have those desires fulfilled, then I think that that's like a pretty strong argument for it too. So in other words, yes, there is like, okay, yes, sometimes our desires can make us impartial, but I think that those desire in this particular case, like those desires are evidence, I think, that that like God has created us. He's created this world the way that it is for a certain reason, and he's like the good news of Jesus is the way that it is for a certain reason to meet those desires as well. So I think you can also go too far on that. Like good, notice your possible biases, but then like also notice that there is an argument even in those biases.
Cool. Yeah, I love that answer. And so are there any final thoughts that you wanted to share? Anything that we didn't cover?
Um, I feel like we touched on most of the stuff from my book. Yeah, I don't know. Were there any questions? I have a few more minutes. If you have any other questions you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, actually, I there's some things in your book that I loved that I just wanted to briefly mention and maybe talk about. But one story in your book that I loved was because I actually experienced this too. But you said like, back in the time when you were living as kind of a functional agnostic and not
Mhm.
paying attention to God, there was one time when you really needed healing for your leg.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Uh-huh.
so do you want to tell that story? Because I think it's awesome that,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, it it was so long ago, but I remember I had like an indoor soccer game, and my leg was bothering me beforehand. And as you said, this is like well before I, really had like any sort of religious conversion or religious beliefs. But I prayed that my leg would get better in time for my soccer game, and it did. It actually, like, it did. I felt good by the time the game started. But I think what I said in my book was I didn't really attribute it to any actual supernatural intervention. It was just kind of like, oh, good, my leg's better, and I guess I got kind of lucky.
Yeah, I did the
Yeah.
same thing when I back in the days when I wasn't really following the Lord, but I always believed in God's existence, but I prayed for healing for my leg. I was actually on crutches and on a trip, and then anyway, God healed me completely, but I didn't even pay attention to it. Like it was like one of those things, so it makes me think about the story of the 10 lepers that Jesus healed and only one came back to thank
Yeah.
him, and
Yeah.
I was definitely one of those 9 that, like, just went on my
Yeah,
merry
same.
way.
Yeah, same, definitely. Yeah. Yeah,
So I
definitely.
love that in your book. I also was really interested because part of your book, one of the things you mentioned was about the book Letters from a Skeptic by Greg
Mhm.
Boyd,
Yeah.
and that was one of the books that I first read when I was
Mhm.
coming to faith in Christ. And so I thought that was really cool that that book played a
Yeah.
role even for you. And it was quite a, I mean, it was an old book by that time, right? I mean, it wasn't a new book.
I can't even remember. I don't even remember when that book came out. I don't think it was new, but I don't even know what year that book was published. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I thought that was interesting. Do you want to talk about your experience of reading that book?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, so that was one of the first books that my brother gave me, along with like a copy of the New Testament, when he started trying to like, convert me basically. And well, so what I when he first tried to give me the books, I told him, look, Steve, I have trouble finding time to read books that I want to read, much less time to read books that I don't want to read. Um, but eventually, I started reading, and I think that book was really great because it's a correspondence between a father and a son, and the son is was and is, I think, a pastor, and the father was a skeptic, someone who didn't who didn't believe in God or Jesus, he and so you kind of like read the letters that they sent back and forth to each other, and you read the father's letter, and he's has all these complaints, all these like reasons why he can't believe in God, or how could God do this, or what about this and what about that. And reading them, you really resonate with what the father has to say, because like, I mean, he's just a normal guy, he just like has the normal questions that all of us do. And I remember every time reading them thinking that there's no, like, these are really good, points, and I don't think the son is going to be able to do a very good job of addressing them. But every time I read the son's answers, I was always impressed by like how much he being Greg Boyd had like thought about these questions. His answers were clearly not stupid. He'd like done a lot of thinking about them, and I think, I didn't walk away necessarily saying like, okay, now I'm convinced, like now I'm a Christian, but it was like, okay, it's like not just a bunch of dummies who believe this stuff. Like there's something more to this, and I really ought to learn more.
Yeah, I had the same experience reading that book, and so I thought that was just kind of actually throughout your book, I felt like I was identifying with you in so many ways. Like so many things that you talked about were like things that had gone through my head, and so I do think this book is really, really good for people who are sort of wrestling through questions of faith and why to believe in Christ, and just kind of on a faith journey and looking for answers. So, and like I did love also about your book that it doesn't provide all the answers. It's not like
Yeah,
you're like
yeah.
you're not a person saying, "Okay, you know, I wanted this answer and here I got it and here's the answer." But you do a good job of like talking through what people might be going through.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope. I mean, there are a few answers there, right? There's like some things that I feel like I learned, but I've also learned that I think that like not every answer is compelling to everyone. So yeah, I hope that I don't know. Yeah, I do hope that people get more resonate with the journey than they do with like the answers. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really fun and I hope we can have more talks. So please guys,
Yeah.
the link to Chasing Proof Finding Faith is in the description of this video. And this is a page turner. When I started reading this, I didn't really put it down. So it's if you like reading about journeys of faith, I totally recommend this book. So thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah,
Fun talk.
thanks
Fun talking.
everybody.
Yeah.